Would you say the partnership model is recipe for disaster?
I'm going to say something controversial.
It is war between the top US firms and the top UK firms. Everything they do is about beating other law firms.
This could potentially be a really good way to balance culture and profitability as well.
So you move from natural competition, where there's plenty to go around, to actually people are killing each other.
What I see is that actually, to really be successful in law as a woman, you almost have to be like a man.
It's the survival of the fittest.
You said, we've lost the war on profitability and now we're losing the war on culture.
So firms have to make it difficult for people to leave.
I've not heard anyone else talk about this idea, probably because no one else is daring enough to do so.
In my day, people like you were the problem, Helen.
What are we being dragged along by? Is it greed? Is it money?
How do you balance culture with profitability without losing both? Younger lawyers aren't following the same career paths as before. They want flexibility, purpose, and a future that isn't just about billable hours. Some are more entrepreneurial, others are more willing to walk away, and many others are less tied to the idea that partnership is the ultimate goal. And yet law firms are still clinging to the same structures. In this conversation, we sit down with Jonathan Watmough, award-winning former City law firm managing partner and author of How to Thrive in a Commercial Law Firm. He now helps law firm partners and partnerships improve performance. We talk about how the industry isn't just changing, it's being rewritten. The shift from natural to strategic competition and what it means for the industry. How law firms can adapt to retain talent in a competitive market, and how the legal industry is experiencing a generational shift. This conversation is all about the future of law, and for those that want to get ahead, this is a must listen. So, Jonathan, do you think that we are witnessing the slow death of the law as a profession in favour of law as a business?
Law's always been a business from day one. Apparently, even if you go back to the 1800s, lawyers were known as men of business. You couldn't say men of business now, but they were called men of business. They were a fundamental part of the business community and finding funding, etc. So being in the business of law is nothing new. Certainly, as long as I've been in it, it's been a business. I think the big difference now is it's a very, very big business. So it's graduated from being a small business in most cases to being a massive business. But no, I don't think professionalism or the professional aspects are being eroded at all in many ways. If anything, I think the impact of the regulator and the impact of regulation is driving actually greater focus on professionalism. And I see, in the stuff I'm involved in, I mean, Helen, you will know, Patrick McCann of Linklaters, for example, the stuff they're doing on the City of London Law Society Training Committee is just exceptional relating to apprenticeships and stuff. So I don't see any impact on professionalism. I think it's still very much a deep profession. I mean, in many ways, it's the business aspects that trouble lawyers more than the professional aspects. The professional aspects are business as usual for lawyers. The business side, that's where it all starts going wrong, because no one goes into the law to become a business person, do they? Let's face it.
So you say that the problem that lawyers have is perhaps that they don't want to embrace the business side of law. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, lawyers are not naturally, they're not natural business people. Business people would have all sorts of different attributes naturally, which would not make them good lawyers. And good lawyers have lots of different attributes which don't necessarily make them good business people. And therefore, good business lawyers who turn into the business of law by nature most of them have to go a considerable distance out of their comfort zone in all sorts of ways, which a lot of them don't particularly like and don't find natural and struggle with. And unfortunately, firms naturally don't necessarily support all that stuff. It's in many cases, it's the survival of the fittest. Those people who either have it within them in some way, shape or form to go out their comfort zone and to learn these things will come through. But so by nature, you end up with lots of people who are very good at the business of law who are not necessarily the best lawyers. The best lawyers, being a top lawyer and being very good at the business of law is ultra rare in my experience.
So, Jonathan, talking about lawyers, their skill set, but particularly with a focus on the future of law, what I find really curious is how law firms and lawyers going forward are going to remain competitive in the market. And you quoted a quote recently in an article of yours where you said, "We've lost the war on profitability and now we're losing the war on culture." Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's not my quote. That came to me from the managing partner of a Silver Circle firm. But I've heard that sentiment for years, actually, so it's nothing new. But that sentiment is that at the upper end of the city, the impact of US firms and the impact of a US business model and the big US firms coming in to compete so heavily as they have done is shifting the culture in a lot of the big law firms, broadly speaking. It's moving to a much more entrepreneurial, individual, numbers strategy based approach, whereas the traditional approach in English firms is much more of a balanced view between people and culture and numbers and strategy. On the one hand, it's not where I came from. It's not what, it's not where, to an extent, it is where you came from, actually, Helen, to a degree. So it's not something which necessarily is natural to a lot of British lawyers, but you pay your money and you take your choice. But you have to recognise that if you're going into that sort of culture, you have to recognise that there are considerable differences. You will be worked a lot harder, and there will be all sorts of other consequences. If you're capable of lasting the course with that, and that's what you want to do, knock yourself out. If it's not for you, there will be variations in other English firms, but I don't necessarily criticize it. It's just the way it is, and the market has shifted in that direction. There's nothing anyone can do about it. And it's not a conscious choice by any of these firms. None of these firms woke up one day and said, I know, we're going to imitate this US model. You just get dragged along. It's like a tractor beam like pull. It's just the way it is. There's too much US capital in London. There's too many US clients in London. And so it migrates towards a US model. It's just the way it is. So it's not something to moan about. It's something to know. If you're a young lawyer going into one of those firms, you have to know what you're getting into.
So to ask a challenging question on that point then, you say we're being dragged along. What are we being dragged along by? Is it greed? Is it money? Is it something else in the US culture?
Look, the whole US culture is completely different to ours. We're separated by common language, as they say. The parallels between the English and the US is so distant, as you can see from US politics now. It just doesn't bear comparison. We've got a common language, and that's about the difference of it. And the whole legal culture, in particular in the US, is completely different. It's a much more adversarial approach. It's a much more individual approach. There's much more cult of the individual involved. And that's just the way it is. It's neither good nor bad. It's just different. But as that stuff inculcates itself into the sort of London city type legal culture, yeah, it's going to have an impact. But there's also a big opportunity for firms to differentiate themselves from that. And therefore, you don't have to follow that course. You can make a conscious decision not to follow that course. But the reality is you will earn less money if you do that. You pay your money and you take your choice. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing as long as people recognise what's really going on.
So what choice did you make when you were managing partner then, Jonathan?
I mean, in fairness, it was a slightly different time. I became managing partner just before the global financial crisis. So I became managing partner in 2006, went through the global financial crisis, finished in 2016. So it was a slightly different time. It wasn't as competitive as it is now. My approach was the only way you can win the war for talent ultimately is by being a very people-oriented place. I wasn't interested in recruiting or retaining people who had an out-and-out, individual mentality. So I came very much. I come from a sort of team sport environment, for want of a better phrase, and therefore it was all about the team. And the only way you can get a team going is if you've got team players. So for me, it was all about people and all about the culture of a team, which is the opposite of, a sort of hard-nosed US mentality. But I had a very different approach. But it's hard. It's very, very, very hard to make that stuff stick. It's counterintuitive for a lot of lawyers to play as a team.
How do you do that? How do you cultivate a really great team culture whilst also balancing scalability, profitability? How do you make that perfect balance?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, Holly, is a simple answer. It's unnatural. There are a lot of things that are pulling against you to do that. So it is possible to scale something as a high performance team based environment. And the ultimate example of that is Slaughter and May. So there's the complete outlier, which shows that it's perfectly possible. You can play absolutely at the top and yet play as a team. Yeah, it's very, very difficult to do that because it broadly speaking, it requires the principles of a partnership culture. It requires alignment between all the people because essentially the laws are, a lot of firms end up as a coalition of lots and lots of independent businesses, whereas a one firm, if you like, has a single identity. So it's completely aligned. All the businesses cohere together. You've got a very common type of person, not necessarily ability, but character of person. So you've got cohesion between the people. And so they can identify with one another. It's not just they identify with the business, but they identify with the type of people. Then you've got real trust in the culture. So you've got those three things. You've got the right people on the bus. Broadly speaking, anything's possible. There's nothing novel about how a high performance team working environment works. You can look at any sports team, lots of different environments. It doesn't have to be business, which requires people to work together in a seamless way and to trust each other. It's very difficult in the law to do that. And it's always been very difficult to do that, in fairness, because you've got a lot of free thinking, independently minded people. And then once you get into a situation where the law is growing hither, thither, and demand is growing, and people are feeling very pleased with themselves about how their businesses are growing, and maybe I can take this business elsewhere. And there's a lot of pressure on lateral hiring, and recruiters are phoning them up 3 times a day and saying, "Oh, Kirkland and Ellis have asked me to call you," which is always rubbish. In fact, they never have any mandate to call on behalf of anyone. Maybe I can do this by myself. Maybe I am worth more than this. So all of these things push against the idea of teamwork. And the trouble is teamwork necessarily thinks and acts very long term, whereas a lot of the pressures on lawyers are very short term. It's what's on your desk in front of you, the client phoning you up saying, "I want it now, I want it yesterday, I want more tomorrow," that sort of thing. And so all of the pressures are very short term. When you end up with very short term pressures, you end up with a focus on an annual P&L. And therefore, you end up with a focus on the individual. So there's a lot of things that mitigate towards lack of teamwork, unfortunately. And then you layer on top the pressure from a US model, and it makes it very, very hard to scale something without following the trend, basically. So it's easier to follow the crowd. And that's what a lot of firms have done. That's why you get Me Too firms. You get firms resembling each other. It's just the way it is.
I love that, Me Too firms.
Which are the Me Too firms? That's what I want to know. I mean,
I love it.
I'm trying to think of it now.
No, well, a lot of firms are identikits, aren't they? You can't really tell the difference between a lot of firms. And firms try and look like each other, end up looking like each other, not necessarily by design, but just because, well, that seems to work in the market, and therefore we'll do that. Firms tend to follow each other. So if a firm opens an office in X, then other firms will open an office in X and Y and so on. We opened an office in Bristol, and at the time, that was a relatively novel thing to do. Bristol is now the biggest legal centre in the country outside of London. It's massively over-lawyered. You wouldn't do it now, but a lot of people have followed suit.
It's like supermarkets, isn't it? You've got a Tesco that opens up, and then an Asda will open up down the road. It's like same with law.
Absolutely right. And interestingly, it's why a lot of city law firms have ended up going back to the city, because it is like Bond Street. You want to be next door. Why? Because that's where all the talent goes. Okay, fine. It's perfectly normal human behavior, I think.
Definitely. I want to touch on something that you wrote in your article, which I think is very, very, very interesting, actually. And I've not heard anyone else talk about this idea, probably because no one else is daring enough to do so. But it's
stupid enough.
No. But it's something that I was actually thinking about in terms of the future of law and what you talk about partnership and the potential of how partnership is going, the partnership model. And I potentially think in the distant future, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but the distant future, the partnership pathway or model might become slightly outdated as more lawyers realize that they need more entrepreneurial skills. You've got Gen Z coming up through the ranks who think differently, who want more work-life balance, well-being, but they're also thinking about how can I be business minded outside of work as well. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on this balance between it, like lawyers in a law firm, just your average lawyer bringing in their own clients as opposed to the partners bringing them in, striking this balance between allowing people to be entrepreneurial but also not deterring people who want that progression and to become partners. How do you kind of make everyone happy, and what do you see as this future of law?
I think there's going to be lots of different models evolve from your high-end city model where, effectively most of the partners are really just employed on relatively short-term contracts in many ways, with a cascade of lots of different types of partner. And what does partner really mean in the context of a law firm anymore? I mean, the common misconception is that partner means you're an owner. Well, it doesn't actually. You don't actually own anything. You've got no real interest no capital interest. You've got no real interest in the balance sheet because it's not saleable, as the listed law firms have found out. There's a paradox of the word partner is used as a concept of partnership and what partnership actually entails, which law firms use as a shorthand for sort of seniority. But what does it actually mean in the context of, does it mean you own something? Does it mean you have a say in something? I mean, very few partners at a law firm really have a say in things. Big law really have a say in anything anymore. They're really corporates in any event. So it's all a bit of a misnomer. Partnership really is a bit of a misnomer. It's a concept that plays out well externally with clients because it connotes seniority and expertise, and therefore it connotes larger charge out rates, etc. What does it really mean internally? Yes, it means seniority. It means bragging rights. It means you can sit next to someone at a dinner party and say, I'm the partner in X, and they go, who? Because most law firms people don't know about unless you're a partner in Linklaters or something like that. So what does partnership really mean? I think it's such a smorgasbord depending on where you are. I think it's less about partnership and more about what happens below partnership actually that's particularly relevant, because the number of people who are genuine partners, as in real out and out equity partners who are doing all of the leadership things and really have serious followings with clients, etc. The number of people who are in that category are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's not necessarily such a bad thing. I think it's just an indication of there are only so many people who have all of the skill set, if you like, who have the client skills and the people skills and are good lawyers and are entrepreneurial and have the drive and motivation to actually spend 99% of their living hours, doing what they do. There's only so many people who have the skill set to do that and have the motivation to do it. And okay, that's fine. And those people are the genuine equity partners. For the rest, you need a cascade of all sorts of different types of offering, from fixed share partner to salaried partner to directors of various sorts to managing associates to senior associates to consultants to, there's as many names as there are, different concepts. And I think firms, in fairness, have been very good at developing alternative career paths to partnership of people who want to do interesting things. So an interesting distinction is the difference between a legal director, someone who's a bit more of a lawyer's lawyer, if you like, versus a managing associate, who typically in most firms, a managing associate would be someone who's more a team-based leader, someone who's more a people person, versus someone who's more of a technical guru, if you like, who you wouldn't want managing people or leading people. But, so there's some interesting distinctions being drawn, which I just think are naturals. But I think your point is an interesting one about how do you reward people? How do you keep people within a law firm environment who are naturally entrepreneurial, but don't want to be an out and out partner? I don't think there's a role at the moment. I don't think there's a role for people like that. I don't think there's a natural fit in many firms for people like that. There's a sort of expectation they'll either come through to partner or they will stay and be an associate, an employed associate. So yeah, I think it's a gap, but that things are changing at such a rate. I mean, the war for talent is such that there will someone will find a solution and it will be a big differentiator and they will attract talent as a result. So it's just the way the market works. I think it will gravitate in that direction.
Is this actually a gap? I'm not sure I've looked at it from this perspective before, but the way we've got an entrepreneurial lawyer who doesn't want to make partner, in my experience, they'd probably leave law. I mean, the whole point of being a partner is at that point, in theory, if we go back to the traditional structure, being a partner means you're a business owner. Now, I'm going to say something controversial, which I often say to people if they're coaching with me, which is they say, oh, I want to make partner. And I say, well, what do you want? Do you want salary partner? Do you want equity partner? Like, what's available and what are your ambitions? Because when it comes down to it, salary partner is actually nothing more than a glorified employee.
Exactly. Yeah.
No one actually says this stuff. I don't personally see any lawyers who are really entrepreneurial, don't want to make partner and go, you know what? I'll just stay being as an associate. I mean, they go off and they do cool stuff normally. I don't know. Have I missed something?
I think there is another route nowadays, which is those what they call consultant firms. So the Gunnar Cooks and the Keystones, that type of thing, where there's a platform you can sit on, but you are a sole trader. So there is that opportunity, provided that you can actually get clients and you can feed yourself. So there is an opportunity, but the challenge, of course, is anyone who's been brought up in a law firm is used to unbelievable support and clicking your fingers and trainees and juniors appear and do whatever they're told to do and all that stuff. So the support systems around people are very, very strong. So the opportunity to do something within that support system, entrepreneurial, where you can get some meritocratic reward, but you're not a partner. I think there is definitely a gap for that. And at the moment, the only thing you can logically do is set up on your own effectively in one of those consultant firms. And that's the gap they're filling, which is fine. There's more choice nowadays than there was, which is good. But it's going to continue moving in that direction. Has to.
I think law firms are potentially missing a trick with this, because I think that the skills you learn that you need to become a good partner, i.e. networking, people skills, emotional intelligence, getting clients, being able to market yourself, all these skills. I was never a partner of a law firm, but many people tell me, including Helen, you just one day you're like, okay, I need these skills. And many people have them, but many people don't. And they're just like, I don't feel equipped for this. So I think law firms are missing a trick in this. And there is a gap, like you say, in that they should be encouraging just your average lawyer, your juniors, your associates, just anyone working within the firm to go out there and develop these skills. So by the time they get to potential partnership, or they may not want to even become partner, but the idea that they can have a go at bringing in clients and marketing themselves and the firm, I think it would be a brilliant environment to be part of, because everyone would feel like they're actually valued and that they're important within the firm, as opposed to being these people who are just getting on with the law. If people want to do that, they can do that. But the ones that are potentially entrepreneurial or want to develop extra skills are able to do so with the encouragement of the firm. And it would just make for a much nicer culture. And I think, in going back to what we spoke about at the beginning, this could potentially be a really good way to balance culture and profitability as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the best firms outside of really big law, I mean, broadly speaking, within big law, there is a norm. You just conform to the norm. There isn't really the opportunity to do anything outside of that. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. Outside of that sort of normal, the middle of the normal distribution curve, there are lots of firms who work on the basis of, no, I'm part of my people deal is I'm absolutely going to encourage these people to, open the taps and experiment and stuff. I think there's more than you might think going on in the sort of mid-market firms, because they're much more reliant on people just lucking out and people doing it themselves. So again, it's going to come back to once the gravitational pull towards the sort of, let's call it the individual out and out entrepreneurial US model, once that gravitational pull really starts growing, then there'll be a whole host of other firms who will not be able to compete with that. And to try and compete with that would be professional commercial suicide. And therefore, they'll slew back towards we have to differentiate ourselves on people. And at that point, there'll be plenty of firms who will be coming up with all sorts of different people offerings. It's just going to take time. And it's just the natural way of the market will be that different offerings will come through. The law is incredibly slow to change, and that's because it hasn't had to change. But as competition increases, so that change moves from being evolutionary, which is being incremental evolutionary change, it'll turn into quite rapid bang, bang, bang. Hang on, suddenly things change quite quickly. There could be some firms who just say, right, we're going to completely change our people deal. This is what it looks like. It's a sort of dim sum menu of there's something for everyone. And believe me, that would cause a real stink in the people market, because people go, hang on a sec, I can see that's for me. I can still do great work with great people, but I can do it my way. For a lot of people, particularly Gen Z nowadays, that's going to be a really compelling offering. Someone will do that and it'll stir things up.
In your opinion, Jonathan, do you think Gen Z get too much of a bashing? I'm thinking particularly in your article, you talk about remembering when Gen Y, which I think that's the millennials, I think that's me, were coming through and everyone was thinking, oh God, what do we do with Gen Y coming through? Now it's Gen Z. Is this just another version of that? Because people have all sorts of names for them, snowflakes, they're not pulling their weight, they're wanting something totally different, they're unrealistic. What's your view?
Yeah, no, in my day, people like you were the problem, Helen.
I'm still the problem.
No, but it was for different reasons. I'm sure so I'm Gen X, so I'm sure the baby boomer generation before me, I would have been a complete pain in the ass when I was a young lawyer. I was demanding partnership, blah, 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 I was demanding change. And then I became a junior partner and I was demanding to become a senior partner. I was a pain. And I'm sure that the baby boomer generation before me were looking at me and thinking, God, how do you deal with these people? In the same way as we were holding partnership meetings, 15 years ago, talking about Gen Y. God, they're different, aren't they? How do we deal with them? And now we're holding partners meetings talking about Gen Z. And Gen Y will be holding partners meetings in 10 years' time talking about will it be A or will it be ZZ? I don't know. Whatever it is. It's nothing new. What proportion of the legal population in a typical law firm is made up now of Gen Z? In 3 or 4 years' time, it will be 70% of the population of qualified staff will be Gen Z. And you're going to moan about them? Come on, you've got to get wise to it, So it's just the way of the world. And it's just absorbing change and being able to work with people and reflect that people look at things differently. I think there is with law firms, to a degree, there's a bit of performative stuff goes on. But I think for the most part, there has been quite a big shift in law firms towards values. There's been more of a shift towards values, purpose, diversity, inclusion, governance, equality. I think there's been more of a shift than firms given credit for, albeit it's quite tough because it is so different. There's been two things happen. There's at the same time as demand has increased dramatically, at the same time, the whole people side has become much harder for firms. It's become imbalanced and firms struggle with that. But I mean, the generational divide is just a business as usual thing. You just have to work through and get over.
You said something very interesting there, I think, about your career, which was that you demanded to make partner, then you were demanding to make more senior partner, etc. And I can resonate with what you're saying there, because I think during my career, I was always someone who was thinking ahead. And I just thought, well, if you don't ask, you don't get. And that actually got me a long way. And when I talk to a lot of lawyers now, I realise that isn't what most people do. They don't put themselves out there. They don't ask for what they want. Is that the reason that you were so successful and that you got ahead?
I don't think it's the reason. I think it's, you've got to look after yourself. If you're driven to do something, then you're going to be willing to have difficult conversations along the way. In my experience, lawyers are terrible at difficult conversations. I think if there's one thing that will transform most lawyers' lives, it's the ability to have a difficult conversation without, falling out with people at all levels. Partners are terrible at it. And so in the law, there's a lot of things go unsaid and people leave because they don't voice their concerns or don't voice their ambitions. And by the same token, firms aren't necessarily honest with people, or partners aren't honest with people, because they find those conversations really difficult. Can I really say that? Can I really be honest? I've always felt that those difficult conversations are a combination of clarity and real honesty on the one part, but kindness on the other end, of being fair. You can say something that might be potentially quite hard for someone to take, as long as it's coming from a position of kindness, and their best interests. And lawyers are terrible at those things. So they tend to veer into one or two categories. They'll either go firm, but in an unkind way, or they'll go kind and not say what's necessarily needs to be said. I mean, I've always worked on the basis of tough love is a good approach.
What would your advice to a young lawyer be? Should it be that they should self-advocate for themselves in terms of their career? No.
Yeah, well, you've got to work on the basis that no one else will. If you assume no one else is going to shout your corner, I think most people completely overestimate the amount that other people are paying attention. They're not. And once you get people are not paying attention, once you get that in your mind, you think, okay, well, I'm going to have to push myself out there then, and I am going to have to talk about myself. You can do that in a nice, respectful way without being overbearing. But yeah, you've got to look after yourself. It's as simple as that. You've got to look after yourself.
I just want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, which was that you foresee the legal industry rapidly changing, and it didn't necessarily need to change before because there was no need for it. Why was there no need for the industry to change before?
Yeah, I mean, it's broadly speaking, the industry's been in a period of what strategy theorists would call it natural competition. So in other words, there's plenty of work to go around. All you've got to do is find a trough, get your nose in it, and keep your nose in it and feed. And so you don't have to do anything unduly different. All you've got to do is show up and be professional. And if you're a firm, all you have to do is keep building out a platform and a people base and a brand in order to meet client demand. And client demand was so strong and has been so strong, certainly over the period I've been a lawyer. So I qualified in 1993. So over 30 odd years, it's just been a continual line like that. Okay, there's been a few blips, but broadly speaking, it's been a straight line of client demand. And that's been for all sorts of reasons: globalization, the world coming to London, English law, regulation. There's all sorts of reasons for it. And that client demand is, broadly speaking, going to continue. The fundamentals are still quite good for client demand. However, the big difference is you're now moving to a situation where the market is maturing. There's less opportunity to do a Me Too. There's less opportunity to just keep tucking in, and competition is increasing. So we're moving into, certainly at the top end of the city, you're in a position now of what I call strategic competition. So you move from natural competition, where there's plenty to go around, to actually people are killing each other. And you're into business warfare now. So at the top end of the city, it is war between the top US firms and the top UK firms. And all of that has a massive trickle-down effect. And people who are, a firm between 50 and 100 in the top 100 in the UK might say, well, that doesn't really affect me so much. It is. Coming to a cinema near you soon, the trickle-down effect is really strong, especially in the people market. And the people market is what matters. I think there's a common misconception that law firms have clients. For the avoidance of doubt, law firms do not have clients. Law firms have partners who have clients. And that's a massive understanding. And that's a massive misconception, but a huge thing to understand, and explains why the cult of the individual has grown and grown and grown. There are far fewer institutional clients than there ever were, and there are much more man-marked client relationships now. As you move from natural competition into more strategic competition or warfare, then you get people pulling different stunts. You get a pay war. You get people saying, I'll just carry on paying. There was a really interesting quote came out from who's the chair of Paul Weiss, I think it is, and it came out before Christmas in The Lawyer, which speaks for itself. Everything we do is about taking market share. You've got to think about that. Everything we do is about taking market share. It's got nothing to do with clients. It's about taking work off other law firms. Everything they do is about beating other law firms. You never hear a mention of a client. You never hear about, we're client centric and we're doing this for clients. It's got nothing to do with clients. Everything we do is about taking market share from other lawyers and other law firms. That's quite a statement, but it shows how different it is. They've been in that world for 20 odd years in New York, and that world has now come to London. So you change from incremental, adaptive, evolutionary shifts over time to potentially revolutionary, radical competition. I might be 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead of my time in saying that, but it is coming, and it's here at the top level, and it will splinter down. So yeah, it's going to be different.
That's really interesting. A bit of a revelation, because as we say, no one's really talking about this. And if you say this is potentially the future of law, and I do agree with you, how can firms become competitive? Would you say the partnership model is recipe for disaster if the partners are the ones bringing in the clients? So the firms don't really have the clients, it's the partners. And if a partner leaves and goes to another firm or just retires, then that's it. Is it a recipe for disaster?
Well, that's still, I mean, you can't get away from the fact that in most cases, those relationships are personal, trust-based, individual to individual. You can't get away from that. And in many cases, it's always been the case. It's just that these people are much more mobile now. And they're also, so a managing partner said to me before Christmas, where people are now they're mobile and febrile. So in other words, they're mobile in the sense of they can take their business elsewhere. But there's also a sort of febrile nature of they're more likely to take their business elsewhere, which is why you get a lot of lateral hiring going on in London. It's gradually increasing. And in New York, for example, it's absolutely endemic. It's a huge part of how you grow a law firm. You have to have, as a law firm, it's less about the partnership model. In some ways, the partnership model, that ship has sailed. You know, the idea, if you're a partner in a Magic Circle firm, in reality, you're not an owner. You might not regard yourself as an employee, but you don't have a lot of say in what goes on. You have a lot of responsibility for running the business, but you don't have a lot of say in what goes on. So the whole concept of partnership is a bit more of an organizational theory now than a practical reality. So what firms have to be brilliant at is providing a platform that, well, why would you want to leave? Because you've got everything you want here. So it's a platform, it's a brand, it's the right support systems. So firms have to make it difficult for people to leave. That's hard. If you're a Magic or Silver Circle firm and a partner is going, look, I can move to another major US law firm in London, and I can earn double or potentially triple what I'm earning here and have no different a life. It's not I'm giving up a lifestyle. It's no, it's just I will just earn 2 or 3 times as much. That's a very, very difficult conversation to push back on. And they can't push back on it in some cases. But you end up in a situation of saying, well, if that's what you want to do, and if you know what you're getting into, then go for it. You know, there's nothing you can do. But there's a huge cadre of people who don't want that unlimited upside because they don't want the unlimited downside. They'd rather be within a bit more of a team working operation, a bit more of a sort of English model. And that's what firms like that are they're banking on. And the reality is there aren't so many people who have that out and out entrepreneurial, I'll do anything mentality who can survive long term within the US model. They might go in, there's quite a big incidence actually of younger partners going into the US model and being seduced by it with big numbers and then coming out 2 or 3 years later, because there is definitely a trial by fire sort of concept of you'll get 2 years and we'll see if you can hack it or not, if you can make it. And if you don't, then you'll fall out back into an English firm. But I think the partnership ship in many ways has sailed. So I'm not so concerned about that partnership thing being an issue. It's more a question of how does a firm retain these people? What different things can they do? You have to, as a minimum, there's a big difference in the US model. US firms, a lot of US firms are extremely lean in terms of support systems around lawyers. So they're typically not very highly leveraged. So in a magical silver circle firm, you might have 6 or 7 lawyers, 8 lawyers to a partner. In a US firm, you might have 2. So you're doing a lot more chargeable time for your own account. You've got less support systems around you. You don't necessarily have armies of BD people, armies of support people around at your whim to do a pitch document and stuff like that. So the US firms are leaner because they do not have all these support systems around them. So they are more profitable. A lot of the magic and silver circle firms are in a real quandary at the moment. Do I slash and burn and really lean out in order to drive profit? Or do I do something different? Because the only way you can really keep up with the profitability of a US law firm in London is to slim down a lot of the support side and go lean and mean. So if you're thinking about retaining people and you have a typical partner who wants and has been brought up with all of that stuff around them and relies on that, then that type of partner will stay with you. Someone who's a bit more entrepreneurial, a bit more gutsy and thinks, well, I can hack it in that world. Yeah, they might well leave.
This actually makes me really concerned about the future of law for women in particular, because I speak to a lot of female attorneys in the US, and what I see is that actually to really be successful in law as a woman, you almost have to be like a man. Maybe that's a very controversial statement, but you have to put in the hours. There's no excuse for not billing a lot of the time. You take as minimal mat leave as possible, maybe 6 weeks, if that. You're contactable throughout your mat leave. And then when you've got kids, you're just expected to do everything you always did before as well. It really does make me worried for women, because if that's the way that the big UK law firms are going as well, where does it leave us in terms of, women actually being in leadership positions and for the future of law?
So I completely agree. You're right. In the real world, it's very, very difficult not to do what men do and not compete. It's very difficult. I mean, I don't know what the stats are in terms of male, female, gender diversity in US firms. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect it's not far different. I think the difference is within the US model, the expectation is you are a driven entrepreneur. That's the only way you will get to the top in one of those firms. That's expected, and that's fully understood. I think within the English model, I think there's an expectation that it isn't like that. As if it gravitates towards that, then naturally, statistically, the number of women who are going to be prepared to and equipped to follow that approach, there will be less. The point I make quite strongly is I think there are real limitations on how far the US model can go in the UK, because you have a different type of lawyer here. There is not, the typical British lawyer is not equipped with these skills. Now, you could argue, as one of the top recruiters in London, I've had a bit of a row with about this, is you could argue that over time, the universities will start delivering and law will start attracting a different type of person. That's not the throughput at the moment. So I'm not sure. I think there's a natural limit on how far this model can go in London, because the people are just different. It's not the same character. It's not the same type of person with the same type of drive that are being attracted into law. There are some, but not that many. So I think the US firms naturally will reach a certain size in London, and then that's as far as it will go, unless and until there is a different type of person starts being attracted into the law. In which case, Helen, you'd argue that, just following, the normal distribution curve and statistics, you would say there will be a similar number of women who have those characteristics as there are men, so that you can satisfy demand. But I agree. On the current model, it's hard enough for men to sort of get through that because it is so demanding. So I can't imagine how you would do that if you were from being a woman. But I think it's a very good point. But in time, I think the demographics will shift to support a different type of person. Someone said to me a while back, I think the law is starting to attract the wrong sort of person. That's a really interesting comment. I don't think it's necessarily true. I don't meet a lot of new trainees nowadays, but the students I meet nowadays seem to be nice, normal, regular people who are the same as my generation. So I'm not convinced of that. But you would say that over time, if there is a different need, it will attract more of an investment banking type character. How that person is going to fare in a client world, which is extremely demanding, which requires high emotional intelligence, high ability to deal with difficult people, I'm not convinced. So there could be some fireworks before too long, put it that way.
It does leave me worried from the perspective of, I think, culture and looking at women and women's place in law, because I came from, well, originally I was at Linklaters, as you know, but I went to another firm, Roslin King, where I was an associate. I worked 3 days a week because I was doing a master's and that was my choice, and I had to do all sorts of other things on the side. And I actually became partner on 3 days a week. I didn't ask for partnership. They offered it to me. And I just say all that because before that role, I never believed, coming from Big Law, Magic Circle, that could even be possible. And from my perspective, I feel like for women to be properly included in this profession and to really thrive at the upper echelons, we have to rethink law, and we have to be doing things differently. And I think doing it in this kind of 1980s style investment banker way, I'm not sure that's the best for clients. I'm not sure it's the best for the future. It probably goes beyond just law into other industries, but it upsets me as a woman because I feel like this isn't right, and I don't think it's the best thing for our industry.
Look, I completely agree. But what you and I think is in the best interest of the industry, the market will trash that. The market won't care. So, but ultimately, these things will always sort themselves out. Markets are unbelievable at finding the right balance, and I suspect that big law and the consequences of big law, and this is the deal. Ultimately, that will go in a certain direction, and the rest of the market will go, we have to sort of disengage from that because we can't live with that model, because we will not be able to develop enough supply of people who want to live with that model. And the beauty of it then is, logically, the rest of the market, the independents, as I would call them, logically will start developing hugely differentiated offerings with much more variety, much more flexibility, much more, all sorts of different career paths, which will be really positive. But you'll end up with effectively two really quite different business models. Okay, here's a challenging thought for you. In some ways, the advent of all this massive top-end US competition could end up, for the vast majority of lawyers, could end up as being a massive bonus. And not because of the money it brings in, but because it wakes up the profession in this country there's been a huge drift over towards that model. And the vast majority will have to say, we can't survive in that model. So we have to disengage. And that would be a really positive thing, actually.
This episode is sponsored by Lex Influence, a legal marketing agency specializing in LinkedIn content and management and podcast services. We're not just shaping the future of legal marketing, we're redefining how law firms connect, influence, and lead. If you'd like more information, just go to the description of this podcast episode. Lex Influence, where law meets influence.